Let's get things started. So, of course, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about the new features in Onshape. So, what's new in Onshape is the subject today, and we're just going to walk through all the updates in the last release. So, all the new features, all the new functionality that we launched in the last month or so. If you haven't attended one of these webinars, once a month we try to put together a webinar that covers just the new functionality of the last update, the last update or two in some scenarios. So what's new in Onshape? Really an opportunity for you to ask questions regarding what's new functionality and for me to show you all the new features. One quick question that's already come up: can you demonstrate how to create a drawing template? We won't be covering specifically creating drawing templates in this webinar, but I have done a webinar on that topic in the past. So if you do a search, you'll find a past webinar specifically on drawing templates and properties and other things. So definitely check that out. All right, so what's new in Onshape? And again, the goal today is really just to give everyone a brief overview of the new features that were added in the latest release, and then also for you to ask any questions that you'd like about these new features. There's a questions dialog, and you go to Webinar Control Panel. Feel free to ask any question, and I'll do my best to stop and address them from time to time. All right, so let's dig into it. Now, the first thing I want to get into before I get into any of the topics of the day is just our mission statement, our goal with Onshape. So if you're new to Onshape, the mission of Onshape is getting everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere. This includes mobile devices. So if you haven't downloaded the Onshape app for Android or iOS, I definitely recommend it. You get a full-blown CAD editing tool on your phone. You can create sketches and features and parts and assemblies from your phone or from your tablet. So a full-functioning CAD app in the form of on your mobile device, but also any computer, Windows, Mac, Linux, even Chromebooks. You have accessibility to that CAD data. So again, our mission with Onshape: everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere. Now, the other thing I always like to mention is we do consider ourselves, of course, professional 3D CAD. And when you think of professional 3D CAD, it's generally just parts, assemblies, and drawings. And I think that's kind of the core functionality that everyone associates with professional 3D CAD. But there are a lot of things that Onshape provides that aren't in other professional 3D CAD systems. For example, frequent updates. Roughly every 3 weeks, of course, what we're talking about here today, you'll see new things being added to Onshape. So you log in, new features will be there. And the neat thing is you don't have to do anything. You don't have to download or install anything. You simply log in and new features are there. So frequent updates, roughly every 3 weeks, you'll see new features being added to Onshape. Now, the other thing to mention is with Onshape comes built-in version control. So keep in mind, you don't have to have a separate data management application, a PDM application, quote unquote. You can use Onshape's ability to version control within the document. Also, the ability to import and export common CAD formats. So if you have a library of CAD data in another format, maybe you've come from another CAD system or you just have this big library of CAD data, chances are we can work with that data. Either import or export. It means that Onshape works really well alongside other applications or in certain roles where maybe you don't want to buy a very expensive CAD license just to view the model or make simple changes. So read and write common CAD formats means Onshape works well with other CAD files and also with other CAD applications. The next thing I want to mention is entirely new methods of collaboration. If you haven't shared your document yet, I definitely recommend it. There's a big share icon in the top right corner. You enter their email address, define their permissions, and hit share. And you're working on the same model at the same time. So unlike any other system, you're not sending files back and forth. You're working on the same set of data. Anyone makes any change in any device, everyone sees it update live. So real-time collaboration on your CAD models. That's something that's never been done in professional 3D CAD before. The last thing I want to mention is customization with FeatureScript. If you're at all adept in programming and interested in creating your own CAD feature, we have a language that we developed that allows you to do that. And it's a full-functioning programming language that allows you to build your own CAD feature. And they look and behave the same way as Onshape's native features. So, in fact, we've even released the source code for many of Onshape's Part Studio features, and you can use it as tools to build your own. So, very cool stuff. If you're at all interested in programming and at all interested in building your own CAD feature, you can do them. And you can build essentially features that save you time, ensure things conform to standards. There's all kinds of really neat things you can do with FeatureScript. All right, so these are just some things I like to mention in general. I see a few questions. Is it possible that my iPad 2 doesn't support Onshape? It is possible that some very old versions of the iPad, I shouldn't say very old, but it's relative, but older versions of the iPad are not supported. I do know that you have to forgive me on the iOS version, but I do know that it's 64-bit specific, so that will give you an idea of where that version is. It is possible it's not supported, but it would be an older version of the hardware. And I know there are some limitations to that as well in Android and some older Android hardware. You may have limitations, but it's relatively flexible, I would say. Anything bought in the last 2 years, I would say, is probably going to be fine, even longer in many scenarios. Are there any plans to add rendering to Onshape? Rendering is available in a few different forms in the Onshape App Store. So if you haven't checked out the Onshape App Store, there are cloud-based rendering tools. There are familiar installed desktop tools that connect to your Onshape account. Onshape itself is not going to focus on rendering, at least in the immediate. We have many different partners that do that, and they do it well. So definitely check out the Onshape App Store. There's great rendering apps. Many of them run right inside of the document, right? So you can choose to render right inside of Onshape, use cloud-based resources, and so on. All right, so let's move on now. The thing that I want to get into today is the update process. And as I mentioned before, our update process is different than other professional 3D CAD systems. It's not something that happens, once a year. Oftentimes in other CAD systems, you get one update a year. In Onshape, we push out updates constantly, roughly every 3 weeks. So roughly 14 times a year, you're going to see new functionality being added. Now, this could be also bug fixes, but most of the time it's new features. And what we cover here is these new options, new features, and ways that you can use them. Some other things I always like to mention about Onshape's updates: they're automatic and they're transparent. So what that means is you don't have to do anything. You log in and everything's up to date. So there's no manual process for you to update. You simply log in. The updating of the documents, the updating of new features, all that is done in the back end for you. And it also means that you never have to worry about being on an incorrect version in Onshape. And the reason that's important is if you've ever used a file-based system, you'll know you need to be on the same version that you're sending files back and forth, or you can't go back and forth between versions. So that is never an issue in Onshape. Everyone using Onshape is using the latest version, right? So there's never any version discrepancies. Now, the last thing I want to mention is the updates do include new functionality. Of course, that's what we're talking about here today. And those new features just appear. You'll see them there. And our goal with these webinars and also our blog posts, if you're not subscribed to it, I'd recommend checking out our blog posts. We post blog posts roughly every 3 weeks for the new functionality as well. What we want to do here is give you some idea of how to use these things and how we can see them as being useful for you. All right, question. Can you load a SOLIDWORKS 2015 part with a history tree? No. You cannot load anything with a history tree, and that's important to keep in mind. When you import geometry from another CAD system, there's no way to bring in the features of that CAD system as well. There's no direct translation between systems. Do old drawings update to new functionality? What about backwards compatibility? Can an update break my document? No. An update should never break your document, and there's never any issues of backwards compatibility. That's part of the key of keeping everyone on the same version. This is something that you shouldn't have to worry about at all. In an ideal world, you should never have to concern yourself with what version of Onshape am I using. You're always on the latest, as is everyone else, and that's the idea behind it. How frequently the PDF help can be updated to include a new feature, and possible to have an offline feature script document. It's not possible to have an offline feature script document. You could use the API and generate things, but there's no offline Onshape. And the help is not, it's not available in a PDF. I guess you could export it as a PDF, but the help is available under the drop-down menu, and it's always updated. So the question mark menu in the top right corner, you'll see help. And this is constantly updated, much like Onshape itself. So, every 3 weeks, much like the blog posts and, new functionality being added, help is also updated. So another good resource if you're interested is the help. I'm new to Onshape. I hear that the program is 100% browser-based, no software. What happens if I lose internet connectivity? Do I lose access to the program until I get back online? Yes. Onshape requires internet, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. If you can't check your email, you won't be able to use Onshape. Now, we run just fine on a 4G connection, even a 3G connection. I've used Onshape many, many times tethered to my phone. So just realize if you have no internet connectivity whatsoever, yes, you will not be able to access your Onshape data. If you look back at an old version, perhaps a newer tool is not available. What is the best way to handle it? If you look back at an old version, perhaps a new... if you look back at an older version, I'm not sure what you're referring to here. Perhaps a newer tool is not available. That should never be the case. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, so forgive me. Even if you're restoring the document to, months back, you can, there's an upgrade that happens that will bring you to the latest version. So this should never be an issue. Again, this is something you should never have to worry about. Right? Everyone using Onshape's always on that latest version, no matter what the scenario, and that's the idea. All right, so as I mentioned before, there was one big update that I wanted to discuss in this webinar, and it happened on April 13th. I'm going to pick a few improvements to walk through and really try and dig into scenarios where you might use them and where they're applicable. The update that I'm referring to was a big one. It happened on April 13th, 2017, and it was definitely one that a lot of users have requested. Projected curve, bridging curve, merge surface, for example, Sketchconics. These are all things that a lot of users have really requested. This is a good point to mention. This is something that was mentioned in the questions. Updates don't roll out to all documents immediately. Now docs see the update immediately. New docs see the update immediately. Older docs take a couple of days, and that's important to point out, yes. So when we launch a new update, it will be a few days, typically 2 to 3 days before all the documents are updated. And as I mentioned, it's just something that happens in the background. But when you first if you log in immediately, you will not see projected curve, for instance, until that document is updated. Again, something that runs in the background, something you really shouldn't have to worry about, but just realize when we announce a new feature, it may be a day before you see it in your old documents. New documents, you'll see it right away. But definitely something to be aware of. If you're, in that notification, you immediately see us post something that says, hey, we've launched new features. Keep in mind, old documents may take a day or two. All right, so as I mentioned before, April 13th, this was an update that many, many users requested a lot of these features. In particular, projected curve, the ability to merge surfaces, Sketchconics. These are all things that have been on our to-do list for a while and have definitely been highly requested. Now, there's other what I call little ones, but for many users out there are going to be big ones. Big things that may not be huge functionality, but make a big difference. And I think that's, of course, very subjective. But break view is a very important one, especially if you're working with long parts, creating drawing views of long parts. Flip dimension text, another small one that may be big to you, but the ability to flip the dimension text to the other side of the leaders, very important in vertical dimensions. We can now do that. In general, curve improvements, and this is something that you'll see in different areas of Onshape, but curves are treated more uniformly, I would say. They're more consistent with other things. So you'll see curves in the feature list as their own separate item, like you see parts or like you see surfaces. So now you'll see curves as an item that makes it easier to hide and show, makes it easier to rename, delete, and so on. So they're treated just the same as parts and surfaces in that sense. Another improvement to curves is when you import geometry that has a curve, you'll now see it. In the past, you wouldn't. We just didn't import, the curve data that came in with your imported geometry. So little things like that can make a big difference if you're doing imported work or if you're working with curves in general. We've tried to make that whole workflow a lot smoother. The last thing I want to mention here, and this is more for those companies out there that are administering custom properties, is you'll have a new user type when creating properties. This is particularly useful if you have a property that needs to be assigned to a person or is tied to a person's name. A good example would be like an approved by property. where, I don't want to just type in that person's name. I want it linked to their username, right? So a user type property, if that isn't immediately clear, give me a moment, I'll explain it to you. But it's just a valuable thing when you're creating custom properties, as you don't have to just type in a user's name, you'll actually link it to their user. All right, so these are just some of the big things that I wanted to mention here today. Let's jump right into Onshape. And we're going to start with a projected curve. Now, a projected curve, this is something that you could do you could use a technique to accomplish it, but it's always kind of a workaround. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say that you wanted to model something like this mouse. These shapes aren't the easiest to model using, solid commands, and oftentimes I may want to create using surfaces. And if I go back, let's roll back to see how this is done. If I roll back here, you'll see that there's essentially two surfaces that were created. Right? So here I've created two independent surfaces, and these surfaces were there solely for the purpose of construction. The reason these surfaces were created so that I can get the intersection of those two surfaces. You can see this is a 3D curve. That 3D curve is then used as a profile in my loft, right? And so when we start moving our way down here, you can see that I'm lofting to create the shape of this mouse. And I'm using that curve that was generated by the intersection of two surfaces. This is a common technique that I've seen a lot of users do to create what's often referred to as, in other CAD systems, a projected curve. And all it is you're extruding two profiles until they meet, and then you're grabbing the curve that's generated by the intersection of those two, right? Now we actually have a specific command for this. So this is a technique, kind of a workaround that I've seen a lot of users do. Now you can skip that step and go straight to the projected curve command, right? So instead of extruding two different surfaces and getting the intersection of them, I can just say projected curve, click on one sketch, click the second sketch in the dialog here, and click on the second sketch, and I get that projected curve between them, which is the intersection of those two sketches, right? So in examples like this, I'm really saving myself quite a few different steps, and you can imagine more complex geometry, it only gets more detail, right? So this is a good example where it was possible before, but it took what many considered to be a workaround. Now you can just say create the projected curve from two sketches, and you'll get that 3D curve that you can use in your loft or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. All right, so this is the projected curve command. Question. When you say curve, I guess this doesn't include arcs in a sketch. Does curve mean 3D curve? Yes, you could think of it that way. It is. They don't necessarily have to be 3D, but it is a separate piece of geometry. It's not like a piece of sketch geometry. A curve is a separate thing. In fact, you'll notice here, curves are listed as their own item in the parts list now, and that was part of what I was referring to earlier. But yes, they are not the same as arcs in a sketch, for instance. They're another good example of a curve would be a helix, right? A helix is a good example of a curve. And I also have another example in just a moment that I'll show you. What is the best way to add draft to a surface that's not a flat surface attached on either end? Such holes that are patterned and intersect and not a flat surface. What is the best way to add draft to a surface that has not a flat surface attached on either end? I'm assuming if the issue is what is your neutral plane, I think you can use a plane. You may try inserting a plane to reference for your neutral plane of the draft command. It's hard to give you advice based on that. It would have to look more closely, forgive me. If you're looking for just the ability to select a neutral plane that you don't have, a flat face on either end, I think you can use a plane for that. I think you can insert a plane for that. Under the hood, does the projected curve automate the steps of workaround, or is it built in a totally different way? It is. You'll have to forgive me. I'm not the developer behind it, but I do know that there's specific work done, not just to how this was created, but the underlying abilities of it. The curve functionality in general had to be improved to get these kinds of things. So forgive the vague answer. I think it's a little bit of both. I'm sure that the geometry is created in a very similar way, but the ability to display curves in a way like this and see them in the feature list is of course, built in a different way. What about projecting a sketch onto a curved surface? This is something you can't do today. You can extrude and then offset, and there's techniques for this, but there's no option in the projected curve to choose a surface as of today. Can that projected curve be used as a sweep path? Absolutely. Yeah. You would need to, most likely, need to insert a plane at the end of the curve, but yeah, I don't see why not. All right, so this is the projected curve command. Again, you'll find it under the dropdown. You'll see it under Helix, right? So Helix, you'll have projected curve and the next topic, which is a bridging curve. So again, the next big thing, in my opinion at least, the two big things with this update were projected and bridging curve. The next one is especially useful if you're trying to create a little bit more detailed or complex lofts. And I'll give you an example of this. Bear with me for a second here. This is a squeegee model that I've used many times. If you've ever attended one of our other webinars where I've shown a loft command and a few other commands, I like to use this model. But there's always been one big limitation with the way the geometry I created here. If you look at this squeegee and you look at how the loft is constructed, if we jump back into the loft here, it's constructed using a series of guides. So guides are really controlling the loft here. All right, so if we roll up just real quickly. So you can see these are guides that control the shape of the loft. The problem with them, they worked fine. You can see the overall shape looked okay, but it wasn't this smooth transition that I was looking for. And the problem with this is they're based on 2D planes, right? Of course, the limitation, if I go to these planes here, you can see they're just flat splines, right? Flat, so to speak. They're on a 2D plane. So it always kind of limited what you could create. Now we can create something called a bridging curve. Now, a bridging curve is, I think, especially useful in these scenarios where you're trying to define guides in a loft. It allows you to do some really cool stuff, creating 3D curves that can be very useful in this scenario very easily. And I think that's the big thing. You don't have to go through a lot of complex steps. So let me give you an example. Here's very similar. All I've done is really split the handle up so that I have these edges that I can define for tangencies. But you'll see the option under bridging curve. Under Helix, you'll find bridging curve. Now, first off, you can choose a simple match position. This is probably going to be your default. And all you're doing here is clicking on a point on one part and a point on another part. Right? Make sure to, by the way, click second side, then click on the second point. That's an easy mistake to make. But now you'll see I have a curve that just joins the 2 points. Right? This is very similar to what I had with the 2D plane, and sketching in the geometry, but it's much easier. Right? I'm just clicking 2 points, and there I have a curve that joins the two. That curve can then be used for my guide in my loft. But, this is a very simple example where I'd have a very sharp transition between them. What if I wanted a very gradual transition, a very smooth transition between these contours? Then I can use, if I really need that smooth transition, match tangent. And this is a really powerful way. Give me a second here. Instead of clicking the end point, I'll click the edge. All right. Again, come to my second side. Let's choose match tangent. Second side. Again, instead of clicking on the end point, I'll click on an edge. The benefit of this is it recognizes and maintains the tangency with the edge, which gives you that smooth transition between profiles, right? So again, I'm just clicking instead of the points, instead of going match position and clicking 2 points, you choose match tangent and choose 2 edges, and the curve will then become tangent with the edges you select, right? This is a very useful way to get a curve that can then be referenced as a guide in your loft. There are other examples where this is useful, but I think this is definitely one of the most applicable scenarios where you're going to use this command. So again, bridging curve, select either 2 points and just do a sharp transition between them, or you can choose match tangent, choose 2 edges, and it will maintain the tangency between the edges. When you do match tangent, you have 2 additional options, magnitude and bias. You can think of this like a scale. So the more I set the magnitude, the more it extends that tangent transition out further, right? Creating a sharper transition in the middle. And then the bias is just shifting it left to right. And you can adjust both of these, by the way, with the grab arrow as well, right? So I can grab and pull this and just kind of manipulate it until I like what I see. And I can grab the bias here and drag it left or right, and kind of manually adjust that bias. So it's a great tool for, tweaking the curve to get it just what you're looking for, and then using that as a guide for your loft. All right, so that is the bridging curve. I'll go ahead and hit the green check. 3 more of those, and again, no need to construct planes. I'm not limited by the fact that it's a 2D sketch, right? Like my past examples, I've always shown that was always been a 2D curve. Now I can use a 3D curve and just generate it using a bridging curve. So definitely a very cool one, especially for those creating those more complex shapes using lofts. For a bridging curve, will they add the ability to have a different magnitude on each end? I think that's the idea behind the bias, is the ability to set the magnitude by manually grabbing the bias and dragging it to one end or another. I'm not currently aware of any option or any plan to add an option for a separate magnitude, a start and end magnitude, for instance. But definitely let us know if you think that's a critical thing. Use that feedback tool and let us know. So that is a type of 3D curve, correct? That is a 3D curve. As is a helix, as is a projected curve. They're all considered 3D curves. But again, the neat thing about this is very easy to create and very simple to create geometry that matches curvature. And I think that's what a lot of people are really looking for. How do I create that smooth transition in my loft? The match position bridging curve didn't appear to have any curvature. Will match position always just create a 3D line? It's just going to create a curve, a straight curve between 2 points, yes. Can you bridge between more than 2 points? No. It's a start and end. How do you create the lines along the handle that you used for tangency? I use split just to split the model up. So I extruded surfaces and split it. That's one technique. You can always, of course, later merge everything back together. That gives you your lines. It's up to you. An edge is a very simple way to define tangency with another part. Now that there's a bridging curve function, will there be any effort to provide 3D line or spline creation functions? I will say this is an area that we're working on. I can't give you specifics about are we going to have a 3D line or spline function soon, but I will say it's an area we're working on, and yeah, you're going to see more in this area, curves in particular, but also 3D splines and things like that, definitely in the coming soon. It's definitely a high priority for us, and as you can see, that's kind of the direction that some of our development efforts have been working on. You mentioned merging existing surfaces. Where is that function? Okay, so that is a good segue. Let's move on. So that is the bridging curve command. Feel free to ask any questions if you have any, but I'm going to move on to merge surface. And this is one that a lot of users, again, have requested. It is specific, again, to extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft. So just keep in mind that's where you'll see this option. But if you're going about constructing surfaces, it's a very easy way to merge with other surrounding surfaces. Now, there is one important caveat that I want to stress with this, and this is that they must share an edge. And I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. So let me give you an example. This is the handle of the squeegee. So the squeegee I was showing you a moment ago, the handle has these kind of curves for the grip. And if you construct this using surfaces, you would use a series of surfaces, right? I might want to break this up into a few. So the option that I'm referring to is within the extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft command. So all 4 of these commands have this new option. You select the command you're looking for. It doesn't matter if it's extrude, revolve, sweep, or loft. Choose surface, and you have a new option for add. Okay, this is what wasn't there before, and now it simply means add this loft to another surface. All right. So let's get started. Let's say that I want to loft from here to here and create the first part of my lofted surface. All right. So now I've got one lofted surface. Now I want to create the second part of my lofted surface. Again, loft, choose surface. This time choose add, and then choose the second part of the contour that I want to loft. Right now, what I want to point out is you must have some kind of a shared edge. So if I choose new, you'll see this loft generates, but it does not yet add to this surface. To do that, I need to have them sharing an edge. And the way to do that, the easiest way to do that is just to use the edge of this surface as a guide for this one, right? So I'll choose guide, click on an edge here, and now it's able to merge the two surfaces together, right? Now, this is not the knit command. This is not the ability to knit two surfaces. We realize that. That's something we're working on. So realize you can't do that today. This is solely in these extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft command. You'll have this add option. We definitely realize there's a need for that, and we're working on it. But realize today this is limited to extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft. But you have the ability to define it as a new surface or add to an existing surface, right? So you can see now I have just one surface in my parts list, my feature list. You can see I have two different lofts that created them. And you can keep going, right? I can go another loft between here to, here. I can add guides of my, spline definition. Oh, let's add guides here, spline, and I can add this edge. Again, make sure that they share an edge, and now I have three lofts that have all been used to create that one surface, right? And so to close this up, just be one more loft between here to here with a guide here, right? So if you're doing this kind of, face-by-face manipulation of surfaces, definitely realize, there's a new option. It doesn't matter whether it's extrude, revolve, sweep, or loft. Under surface, you'll have this new option for add. And of course, the ability to do things like knit surfaces manually as a separate command is definitely something that's high on our list of priorities. Question: Can I offset the loft surfaces? Create something similar to hydroformed tubing. We do have a dedicated offset surface command. So if you're interested in offsetting a surface, choose the offset surface command in the toolbar. Now, I should point out this icon is new. We had this functionality for a few updates now, the ability to offset a surface. But in the last update, we actually added an icon for it and split it away from it was in the move face command. So just realize there is a new icon in your toolbar for offsetting a surface. And as the name implies, you just select a surface and it offsets it. All right. So, definitely check out the offset surfaces command. How would you turn those surfaces into a solid? You would use thicken. So there is a thicken command in the toolbar. The grip is not completely offset. I think that's because of tangency. Bear with me for a second. I think that's because of tangency. It's not automatically grabbing both faces. I think, let me try that again. If I just select both faces, it should work fine. So offset surface, I think I have some curvature which requires it to be smaller, but just choose both, in this case, surfaces, both faces. Right. In this case, I'm choosing face of loft 1, face of loft 5. So I'm choosing individual faces, and I need to select them independently. I could choose just the surface, by the way, from the actual parts list as well. But again, that's offset surface. You'll see that right here in your toolbar, new icon. The capabilities have been here for a few updates now, but we wanted to make it easier to find and create a separate icon for it. Have created those surfaces, would you turn it into a solid and thereby make it a part? Yes. Generally, I would say most users, the surface is just a construction technique for creating a solid. It's a tool that helps them get to a solid, the solid still being the end goal of your model. Surface modeling is a technique that allows you to do some unique things with faces and treat them independently. But I think in the end, for most engineers today, the goal is still to have a finished solid part. Can you demonstrate thicken? We have before. It's very simple. You choose thicken and select the faces that you want to thicken. If you're interested in more detail, definitely check out. I think we've done a surfacing webinar that covers that specifically. One thing that we don't have today is an option to thicken into an enclosed volume. You'd have to offset a thickened amount, right? A certain amount, but that's another area that we're working on. But definitely check out, I believe it was our surfacing webinar where I go into more detail on thicken in particular. I use the webinar mouse, by the way, that you're looking at earlier. Is there a way to go about creating a surface by boundary? You can loft and define edges of your profile as edges of your geometry as edges for your loft. The only limitation with that is matching the surrounding curvature on all 4 edges. So, but I would definitely check out the loft command if you're just trying to close a surface, for instance. There's techniques for doing that. All right, so this is the merge surface command. Again, it's just an option within extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft. You'll see that under surface, the option to add. The next thing that I want to get into is Sketchconics. And this is something that, again, a lot of users have requested for a long time, and it's now an option. So in your Sketch toolbar, you have a new option for conic. You can define a row value and also a point to manipulate by. So let's get into it. Here's a simple example. Bear with me. Let me edit this sketch. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to add a conic on the end of this part, right? What you'll find is under the arcs dropdown, a new option for conic. And it's very similar to a 3-point arc and how you create it. You left click to define the start and end, and then you manipulate the mouse around until you're satisfied with the size, and then left click, right? So left click, start, left click, end, then move my cursor in or out to manipulate the conic, right? And I can do a few things with this. I can attach the point here, right? And when I left click, I can enter a row value, right? So let's say 0.5. Now, you also have a point that you can manipulate. So if you decide to attach this point to another end point, for example, and then dimension that, whatever it may be, just keep in mind you have a point out here that allows you to attach and give you things like symmetry, like in this example. But again, Sketchconic, you'll find it under the arc drop-down, the very bottom here. Very similar to applying a 3-point arc, except, of course, you're defining a row value rather than an arc size. All right, so that is the Sketchconic command. Let's move on. The next thing on my list is delete face and the option to leave open. And this is something that, again, if you're working with especially imported geometry, or if you've ever had an issue where you import geometry and you have a bad face, a bad geometry, for example, where the faces don't line up or you have some kind of a geometry issue, now you can simply delete faces and leave those faces open. In the past, you could use delete face, but it always tried to heal the surface, which isn't always what users want, right? Sometimes I want to manually fill in those surfaces with other commands. So just keep in mind, again, you can use delete face, just delete a face off of the part and convert it into a solid. And that's an important thing. Keep in mind, if you do a delete face with the leave open option on a solid part, you're left with a surface. All right, so let me give you an example of this. Let's say that I've imported some geometry and I have some kind of an issue with a face. And working with imported geometry can sometimes be troublesome. We have great direct editing tools, so definitely check those out first before you resort to deleting and leaving open faces. But oftentimes this is the technique that users ask for is, how do I just delete this face and leave it open as a surface? And now you can. So the command is pretty straightforward. You choose delete face, you choose the new option to leave open, and then you just go through and select the faces that you want to delete, right? Notice this is one solid part right now. The moment that I do a delete faces and I start removing these faces, it becomes a surface part. Right, so I can go through and say, okay, I want to get rid of all these faces, right? And what you'll see is now I have one surface, right? So again, if you're looking for a quick way to remove geometry and then come in and maybe add new features, new surfaces, and clean things up, definitely check out the new option in delete face for leave open. As the name implies, it removes the faces you select, it deletes the faces you select, and it just leaves an open surface. Right? All right, so if you're looking for a way for manually repairing imported geometry, I think that's a common workflow. Definitely give it a shot. Otherwise, by the way, I should mention this, the options for heal and cap are both still there, right? So, these are not new features. They allow you to automatically heal faces and things like that. So, all right, that is the new leave open option in the delete face command. Let's move on. The next thing on my list, break view. This one is especially important if you create a lot of long parts that you're creating drawing views of. And I think a lot of users out there, if you're defining any kind of big, long parts, you'll struggle to get drawings out of them, right? Drawing views, either you scale it down to a really small level that makes it really hard to see, or you do all these crazy workarounds to make the view look decent. But now we have the ability to take those really long parts that extend well beyond the boundaries of the drawing and break them, right? So let me get into an example of this. I think for those users that have run into this, you'll know what it looks like. This is a good example of it, right? Where I insert my drawing view. The scale is right. I want to see this at this size, but I don't need the overall length of this. I can take this and break it down into pieces and then add all my appropriate dimensions. Now, a lot of users today may just scale this down, but the problem with that is these get harder and harder to see, right? So in these scenarios, this is where break view is a really valuable tool, right? And it's fairly simple to use. You'll see a new break view command on the toolbar. You could choose vertical or horizontal, so it's up to you, and you can choose the style of break that you want: zigzag, small zigzag, curve, and straight. I'm just going to choose zigzag. Choose your gap distance. This is the gap between the two breaks when it's done. And then it's just a matter of left clicking where you want to break, right? So let's choose left click, and it breaks the view, right? Now, and the neat thing about this, of course, I can apply dimensions. It recognizes that the overall length is still what it is, right? It's just breaking the view down so that I can see things correctly, but not look at this really long part that doesn't fit on the drawing view. So I think you get the idea. If you're doing longer parts and you all of a sudden run into these issues at the scale you want, it's just too long to fit on the drawing view, definitely check out that break view command. Question: are you planning on introducing model-based definition and capability at some point? I would say absolutely. That's high on our list of priorities. I can't comment on whether it's immediate goals or not, but it's definitely up there on our list of priorities. So yes. All right. So break view, as I mentioned, very useful for long parts. You'll know if you need it because the moment you insert a drawing view and it doesn't fit on the sheet, you're going to ask yourself, "What do I do?" And break view is the ideal tool there. All right, so let's move on. Now, that is break view. We're going to cover flip dimension text next. Now, this is one that, again, a lot of users have requested. It's a small thing, but it's a big thing, if that makes sense. Small things, little UI things, little things that make things cleaner can often make a big difference. And ironically, of all the improvements here, I know many users would consider this their top improvement, even though it's very, very simple. So the big thing here is vertical dimensions. You can now flip the side of the text, flip the side that the text is on. And in the past, you basically had one option, depending on the orientation of the dimension. Now you can choose which side. So it's a small thing, but a big thing if you're creating a lot of detailed drawings and you have issues with spacing dimensions. Question: explain model definition. Model-based definition means that you're defining all the important factors in the actual model. So, not just adding dimensions to the sketch level, but also defining the tolerances between, faces, the tolerances of dimensions, or I might have, concentricity callouts, or all of those things actually built into the 3D model rather than reflected by the drawing. So model-based definition is a growing trend where you're foregoing the typical drawings in favor of adding all of that information into the actual model. Right? All right, so let's move on. Now, as I mentioned, flip dimension text is one that a lot of users requested. It's a very simple one to show you, but it's a new option. So here's an example where I have a vertical dimension, and you can see that the text for the dimension is on the right side of the arrow. And there are some scenarios where I may want this on the left side of the arrow. I would just want to flip it. What's new with this update is this point in the elbow of the leader. If you left click this point, it flips the dimension text to the other side of the arrow. It's a small thing, but if you have a lot of really detailed dimensions in here, that can mean a big difference in positioning that dimension relative to the others. A question that came up, and I honestly don't know the answer, is does flip dimension text work with ordinate dimensions? To be honest, I'd have to try. Forgive me, I'm not sure. How about no leader? No, you're flipping based on a point on the leader, so that's how it knows what to flip about. And there's no way to flip. I don't know what you would flip about if there's no leader. So I think the short answer is no. All right, so that is flipping dimension text. Again, that's a small one, but I think for a lot of users out there, it can be a big one, especially if you're going through a lot of time creating those detailed drawings and you're struggling to position everything. All right, so the next one that I wanted to mention, this is just general curve improvements. I've already briefly mentioned it, so I won't get into too great a detail, but in general, you'll see curve improvements. Now, curve improvements include the projected and bridging curve that I showed you. Obviously, new commands are curve improvements. But in general, curves are treated more uniformly throughout Onshape, and that means that, as I showed you earlier, curves are going to show up in the parts list now. In the past, they didn't. So if you create a helix, for instance, you didn't see it as a separate thing in the list of curves. Now you do. The reason that's useful is you can delete it, you can rename it. It makes it very easy to find it. Hide and show it, another very common one. I need to hide and show a curve. I don't want to hunt through the feature list and find that curve feature. Just show me it in the parts list. Right? So curves in the feature list is another example of that. I've already mentioned too importing curves. So if you have geometry from another CAD system that was constructed using curves, we will import those curves into Onshape, and you'll see those listed in the parts list as well. So just keep in mind, in general, cleaner, more uniform behavior with regards to curves. There's a few other little things that I could mention, but just keep in mind, we're really working on making that experience consistent. All right, so that is general curve improvements. There are quite a few. Does curves mean complex curves? Curves that are not simple lines or arcs. Lines and arcs are what we considered sketch geometry. Sketch geometry that you would construct using lines and arcs on a 2D plane. Curves are an entirely different thing. They can be 3D, right? And they can be constructed using multiple different references, right? Like a projected curve or a bridging curve. I guess you could equate curve to complex surface or a complex curve, but there will be a time when you can combine lines and arcs and curves and work with all of them as one. So the last thing I want to get into here today is user type when creating properties. And this is a particularly important one for those creating custom properties for their company. Really only applies to companies that are out there and want their users to apply, to use a certain user type as a property. And the reason this is important is, imagine that you had an approved by property, right? Again, real quick question. So a 2D spline is not a curve. No. Can we bring curves into an assembly? I don't think so. Bear with me a second here. Bear with me. So the question was, can we bring curves into assemblies? I don't believe so. No. Yeah, I don't believe so. Let me double check this at the end of the webinar. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I'm fairly certain the answer is no. I'll try again at the end. All right, so the next thing I want to mention again is user type when creating properties, and this is really applicable to if you're creating custom properties for your company. So if I go into my company here, I choose properties, I have the option to create a new property. Now, imagine that you had an approved by property where I'm saying this person approved my drawing or this person approved my design. I don't want to just type in that person's name. I want to link it to that username, and that's a scenario where you'd use this. So if I create a new property, I'm just going to walk through. Let's say I want approved by, and the new option that you'll see is this right here for user. And all that means is it's going to allow you to search through your users that you share with, right? So here I can see my default value. Let's start to type in my name there, and you can see I'm searching by users. It's very similar to if I do a share and I start typing in someone's email address, it shows me people I've shared with in the past. Same exact thing here. And it's useful because now in my properties of the document, I can start typing someone's name and actually link it to them rather than just typing in a quote unquote dumb text string, right? Rather than just typing Cody Armstrong, I'm actually linking it to that user, right? So it just makes it easier to apply these kinds of properties. It makes it, more intelligent data rather than just text. And it just makes it easier when you're doing these kinds of, name specific functions. Approved by is a good example of this because it's often a name. It's not a value like a number, for instance. Question, available in the free version? No. This is specific to companies, and of course companies requires a professional version. Creating custom properties in general is specific to just companies. The free version has many properties to choose from, but you can't create your own in the free version. All right, so that is what I had to cover. I know there are a few questions, so I'm going to stick around and answer them. But that's what I had planned. Stick around if I haven't answered your question. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask them again in that questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel. But that's what I had planned, everyone. I want to say thank you and have a good day.